Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 5th history seminar series for Term 2, and the last in the series for this term. I want to start by acknowledging that we meet today on unceded Birchall land, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend my respects to all First Nations people present here today. It is also on behalf of Eureka and myself, I want to thank you all for coming along throughout this term. We have had quite a packed program, and we appreciate how busy everyone is, but in a time when history departments, sadly, as we were discussing earlier, shedding much of their research activity, it's really wonderful to see history thriving at UNSW and these sorts of seminar series getting so well attended. It is my great pleasure to welcome someone who probably needs no introduction, our colleague, Dr. Matthew Birchall. Matthew is, of course, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Laureate Centre for History and Population. His work concerns the economic and intellectual history of colonisation in Australia and New Zealand, with a particular focus on chartered companies. In 2021, he was awarded the Royal Historical Society's Alexander Prize for Best Scholarly Article based upon original research. That was for the chartered companies. And he received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2022. His paper today is entitled Depopulation and Repopulation, Political Economy and Settler Colonialism in the Early 19th Century. I understand it's co-authored with Alison, and we can't wait to hear it. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Eureka, for all the work you do organising these events. The end of the Napoleonic Wars marked the beginnings of a new era for British settler colonialism. As attention shifted from war to peace, British statesmen, political economists, and merchants began to reassess the value of the colonial empire. Over the 1820s and 1830s, political economists revised theories on the value of colonisation. The British state experimented with assisted immigration to the Cape Colony in Upper Canada. Parliament heard a select committee on immigration, and private capitalists underwrote a suite of new colonies in Australia and New Zealand. It was the age of colonial reform. Population loomed large in this energetic new political economy. Colonisation was one response to a domestic problem of surplus population or redundant population, paupers and the unemployed, and also of Irish migration into a strained post-war English economy. As it was often put at the time, in Britain there was a shortage of land, but a surplus of people and capital, while in territories marked as potential new colonies, there was an apparent surplus of land and a shortage of people and capital. Yet, as Alison Bashford and I argue in our recent submission to the English Historical Review, there's an analytical problem with how population is used here. It retains a skewed focus on immigrant demography and economy, while failing to factor in the people on whose lands this colonial reform took place. At the same time, we've missed how carefully early 19th century political economists approached procreative immigration. And so this afternoon, I want to argue that settler colonialism in this period entailed plans for the literal reproduction of colonisers on lands that were simultaneously unpeopled as part of the same process. To understand this dual process, I rethink the political economy of settler colonialism through what we call depopulation and repopulation. This was never simply about moving surplus population from Britain to empty lands. These were occupied territories that had to be actively depopulated through war, disease, and spatial removal to make way for British settlers, who would then repopulate them according to carefully calculated demographic plans focused on biological reproduction. This approach of examining depopulation and repopulation together offers a way to connect intellectual histories of political economy and settler colonial studies, historiographies that are often separated. And this is obviously something that I'm happy to talk about more in the discussion. I want to explore this through two canonical figures, Robert Wilmot Horton and Edward Gibbon Wakefield. But I should note that in the large article, Allison examines Thomas Robert Malthus, and so that section of the paper really sits behind everything I will say, and occasionally there are some references back to Malthus, but hopefully in the final paper it comes across a little bit more elegantly. But very quickly, a brief word there about how Malthus conceptualised repopulation and depopulation. He was distinctive for explicitly tabling the impact of settler colonisation on Indigenous peoples, labelling it war and extermination. And he also worked through in fine detail how colonial societies could repopulate. So I'd just like you to keep that in mind as I discuss Horton and Wakefield, who are both in conversation with Malthus in various ways. So my focus today on Horton and Wakefield is primarily because they are the two figures that move most explicitly from theory to practice. Today I want to start with Horton, Under Secretary of State for War and Colonies throughout the 1820s. Horton's immigration schemes are well known, but his simultaneous engagement with Indigenous dispossession has been overlooked. As we shall see, Horton was devising schemes for settler repopulation while simultaneously negotiating with Six Nations diplomats at the Colonial Office. Try as he might to focus on the mechanics of immigration, he was forced to grapple with Indigenous depopulation. The two processes kept colliding on his desk. I'll then turn to Edward Gibbon Wakefield, the architect of systematic colonisation. I'll briefly examine how Wakefield theorised repopulation, showing how biological reproduction became central to his colonial vision. And I'll also look at his evolving engagement with Maori sovereignty and the violence that resulted when his schemes met resistance. The application of Wakefield's ideas in New Zealand indicates how depopulation and repopulation was far messier in practice than systematic colonisation suggested. Horton was an evangelist for immigration. In fact, the Tory MP and Under Secretary of State for War in the Colonies thought that immigration was the answer to Britain's post-war problems of overpopulation and unemployment. A national system of immigration, he told Malthus, might even prevent the existence of poverty altogether. And in working through his archive, you sometimes get the impression that he thought immigration was the solution to everything, such as his mania for it. Over the course of the 1820s, Horton devised a plan for state-assisted immigration, launched a series of pilot projects in Upper Canada, chaired a select committee, and lobbied for an immigration bill. He also sought the endorsement of leading economists, Malthus above all. Horton's published writings and personal correspondence indicate little interest in Indigenous people and land. Unlike Malthus and Wakefield, who both developed stadial theories of the Atlantic and Pacific New Worlds, Horton stuck hard and fast to the mechanics of settler repopulation, transport, rations, utensils, and land for settler families. Still, I think it is insufficient not to ask how depopulation figured in Horton's work as Under Secretary. Failing to connect First Nations peoples and Horton not only reinscribes colonial categories of waste and unpeopled lands, but it also misrepresents the historical record. In 1824-25, Horton negotiated charters for the Australian Agricultural Company and the Van Diemen's Land Company, both of which surveyed, claimed and ran a stock across vast tracts of Aboriginal land. At Cape Grim, Van Diemen's Land Company workers killed 30 Indigenous people, not only removing them from their land, but removing them from the island altogether. Their bodies were thrown off the cliff into the Southern Ocean. That's a stark example of what Malthus had warned about when he spoke about war and extermination. But the tension in Horton's position became clearest in Upper Canada. In 1821-22, he found himself negotiating with Six Nations diplomats at the Colonial Office, while simultaneously drafting his outline of a plan of immigration to Upper Canada. That is, he was devising a strategy for settler repopulation that presumed Crown title, even as he mediated a conflict over territorial claims elsewhere in the colony. The dispute that crossed Horton's desk concerned contested land at the head of the Grand River in present-day Ontario. In 1784, Governor Frederick Haldimand had granted the Six Nations just under 1 million acres along the Grand River as compensation for the loss of their ancestral territories after the Revolutionary War. The Haldimand Proclamation guaranteed these lands to the Six Nations and their posterity forever, though almost immediately the tract was in dispute and it remains the subject of litigation today. By the time Horton was forced to grapple with the Six Nations land claim, European settlement on the Grand River had ramped up. Those with deeds and those without moved onto the land, legality and lawlessness marching hand in hand. In 1819, the conflict deepened when the colonial government purchased land around the headwaters before selling it on to settlers. The Six Nations challenged these sales, maintaining they had never surrendered control. But the colonial administration was adamant. In their view, the disputed territory had never belonged to the Six Nations. In response, two Six Nations representatives, John Brandt and Robert Kerr, travelled to London in 1821 to negotiate with the Colonial Office, and that's John Brandt on the right. Their diplomatic mission was squarely concerned with the spatial form of depopulation, namely Indigenous dispossession connected to broken treaty promises. For Brandt and Kerr, there was no doubt that the headlands around the Grand River had been in Six Nations possession since Haldimand put ink to paper in 1784. Quite aside from Haldimand's pledge that the Six Nations were entitled to land 6 miles deep either side of the Grand River, the Six Nations had established effective occupation through hunting and fishing. Yet the colonial government's disregard of their rights in land would, they asserted, ultimately destroy the community. As Brandt and Kerr put it, we say destruction because we believe that the sense of injuries received in return for the benefits we have bestowed will fatally influence our future destinies. This was depopulation set out in its starkest form. Horton engaged directly with the Mohawk delegation over the winter and spring of 1822. His apparent wariness with the case is evident in a note he scribbled on the back of a letter from the bookseller and philanthropist Joseph Butterworth, who had inquired about the matter. The case of the Mohawk claims have occupied for some time the particular attention of the Colonial Department. The exchange was often testy. Has Lord Bathurst read General Haldimand's proclamation? Brandt and Kerr pressed. Our habits do not allow us to investigate the distinctions of European subtlety, but General Haldimand's proclamation does not say one word of what you state. If General Haldimand had not purchased the territory which which he therein granted to us, he used His Majesty's name deceptively. And if His Majesty's afterwards acquired that territory, it became ours in consequence of the grant, according to all law, Indian or European. Brant and Kerr pressed further, reminding their supposed allies of the sacrifices they had made in the late war against the Americans. The times when you sought our aid and we gave it is a return for the blood we have shed in your cause, to the injustice which has brought us from our distant woods to supplicate in London. It was a pointed rebuke for Houghton, who was just then drafting his blueprint for colonial immigration to Upper Canada. In the end, the Six Nations diplomats were denied the justice they came to London to secure. The Colonial Office refused to investigate the disputed headlands, instead offering Brant and Kerr a deed to their remaining land in fee simple. Forced to choose between a deed and their claim, the delegates reluctantly gave in. But even this compromise would come undone. Back in Upper Canada, the provincial government made it clear that a deed would only be issued if the Six Nations relinquished their annual presence and became subject to all colonial laws. Faced with these threats, most chiefs withdrew their support for the deal Brant and Kerr had negotiated in London with Houghton. Throughout, Houghton remained embroiled in the Grand River dispute, even as he began increasingly preoccupied with immigration to Upper Canada. In 1825, the very year Houghton was launching his second immigration scheme, the novelist and founder of the Canada Company, John Galt, appealed to the Colonial Office for an imperial statute to recognise the Six Nations claim. And he wrote directly to Houghton. Houghton never replied. The Six Nations would eventually surrender the majority of their lands to the Crown in 1841. What about the Undersecretary's views on repopulation? For Houghton, immigration was a family affair, connecting households to frontier farms and domestic economy to political economy through reproductive settlement. What family had you when you embarked? What family have you now? He asked the Irish immigrants who had settled in Upper Canada as part of his trial experiments. Houghton favoured reproductive couples over single men, designing specific incentives for families. Male heads of households received 100 acres, single men smaller plots. His model of colonisation did not explicitly factor in an equal ratio between men and women, like Wakefield, nor was it as mathematical or theoretical as Malthus's study, but he certainly favoured the immigration of large families, and plenty of them. A large family of children, he said, instead of proving a burden upon him, contribute greatly to his assistance, as useful employment is constantly to be found, even for small children, in a new settlement. During implementation in Upper Canada in 1823 and 1825, his concern with family sharpened, weighting costs and benefits by age and gender. He will state the number of persons embarked, he wrote to Peter Robinson, the superintendent, distinguishing men, women and children and the relative numbers of each. But Houghton went further still, advising Robertson to select only men with families for the second pilot. In 1824, Robinson could proudly report that the proportion of children will exceed that of the former year in the circumstance of not taking single men. And so it did. Of over 2,000 immigrants in 1825, more than 1,300 were children. Still, Houghton well understood the fragility inherent to colonisation. Repopulation always carried the shadow of potential failure, which is why he was so fastidious about every detail, from rations to farming implements, travel logistics to housing. Family and health featured prominently in the questions he sent to the immigrants. What state of disease were they in during the last year? What state of health were they in during the first year? His constant concern was whether settlers had received the necessities of life whether they could sustain, replenish, and foundationally reproduce themselves. Throughout his career, the Undersecretary corresponded with many prominent economists, seeking their endorsement. And Malthus was particularly important to him, with Horton making the most of his distinguished witness in the Select Committee on Immigration in 1826-27. More than anyone else, Horton relied on Malthus to make the political economy case for New World colonisation. By 1830, Horton and Malthus were discussing the new system of immigration being touted by the National Colonisation Society, the group that would become Wakefield's vehicle for publicising systematic colonisation. By this time, Horton had settled on a calculation of costs based on an ideal immigrating family of 5. You are aware, he explained to Malthus, that I had estimated the expense of the colonisation of a man, a woman, and 3 children at £80. In their correspondence, Malthus compared the reproductive economy of Horton's scheme with Wakefield's model. The sending away 200 fathers, 200 mothers, and 600 children would no doubt be more expensive than sending away 200 young couples, Malthus wrote to Horton. But it would be a much greater relief to the mother country and a greater benefit to the colony. Part of his rationale was the age at which another generation would be reproduced. The fathers and mothers are by supposition still able to work, and the children would rise to the age of labour and marry in a more natural and advantageous succession, he remarked. It should be recollected that a young couple cannot produce a full-grown labourer in less than 19 years. For Horton, the end game of colonisation was the condition of the labouring classes in Britain, and of those paupers out of work and dependent on the parish. He believed that a beneficial depopulation of Britain would be affected by the repopulation of the colonies, taking Malthus's thesis that population rests on subsistence and applying it comparatively. In America, population pressure could be solved by territorial expansion, and he remained explicit about land to be had for the taking, notwithstanding his dealings with the Six Nations claim, and notwithstanding Malthus's own noting of likely war and extermination. In insular Britain, by contrast, there was no such option except New World immigration. In the final analysis, colonisation served Horton's cause to improve the political economy at home. Even the welfare of the immigrant families was expedient, insofar as it improved conditions in Britain. Wakefield, however, thought through the repopulation of other lands with a different vision and focus. His end game was far more about raising the value of land and capital in the colonies themselves, and with this in mind, he underwrote schemes to start new colonies from scratch. Newgate Prison was an unlikely backdrop to write an ambitious text on New World colonisation. Yet it was here that Wakefield penned a letter from Sydney. He was serving time for abducting a 15-year-old heiress in a runaway marriage so egregious that Parliament passed special legislation to annul it. A letter from Sydney appeared in 1829 under the wealthy philanthropist Robert Gouge's editorial name, while Wakefield remained in prison. From these unlikely beginnings, his theory would inspire the creation of a cluster of British colonies in Australia and New Zealand, attracting both fierce critics like Karl Marx and influential adherents like John Stuart Mill. Of the political economists Ellison and I examined, it was Wakefield who brought depopulation and repopulation together most comprehensively, in print, in policy, and in practice. Malthus's principle of population and Horton's parliamentary advocacy had inspired Wakefield's new theory of colonisation, but neither grappled with settler repopulation in light of Indigenous depopulation as intensively as Wakefield eventually did. Young couples had a special place in Wakefield's systematic colonisation. He was adamant about this, declaring that such couples were the best members of the new society. But why? Wakefield's primary interest in young women stemmed from their capacity to reproduce. It was generational reproduction that compelled him to foreground heterosexual couples in his colonisation schemes, the ideal providers of lives and labour. Like Horton, Wakefield thought long and hard about who should repopulate the new world. Who exactly should immigrate? What age and sex should they be? While Horton wanted family immigration, Wakefield favoured young couples on the cusp of conceiving children. For him, the power of increase was fundamental. To check this too rapid increase of people in Britain, he wrote, it would be advisable to select as immigrants young persons only, and especially young couples of both sexes. The domestic power of increase would thereby be greatly weakened, and the colonial power of increase would be strengthened in the same degree. Wakefield imagined two scenarios to illustrate the point. First, he speculated on the reproductive rate of a colony that did not employ the selection principle. In such instances, 1,000 immigrants of all ages might not increase the colonial population beyond that number. In fact, the population might not grow at all, it might decline. As many might die as would be born, Wakefield cautioned. The net population perhaps even falling after 20 years, if there were an excess of males. The second scenario promised far greater demographic returns based on the selection principle. If 500 young couples each produce 6 children, the colonial population could increase by 3,500, even allowing the death of half the original immigrants. For Wakefield, selecting wealth, age and sex might even surpass Benjamin Franklin's celebrated observations about New World populations doubling in a generation. Young couples were chosen instead. Britain's settler colonies could treble themselves in the first 20 years. Strikingly, Wakefield used China to amplify his main argument about the importance of young couples to colonisation. And the passages in Wakefield's writings that deal with China are remarkable, not least because they reveal how the supposed avatar of British settler colonialism operated with a vastly expanded racial scope. In a letter from Sydney's much neglected postscript, Wakefield speculated about repopulating Australia with Chinese settlers. Densely populated China, he suggested, might, in the course of a century perhaps, convert the whole of this enormous wilderness into a fruitful garden. For Wakefield, China's population of 300 million meant that it could plausibly furnish millions of immigrants every year until all of Australia was appropriated and cultivated. Here again, Wakefield's thought experiment on Australian wasteland is squarely concerned with reproduction. The conversion of waste into garden would only be possible if the Chinese emperor changed his male-only immigration policy so that females could be permitted to immigrate in equal number with the males. Whether it was Chinese or British settlers, colonisation depended on reproduction. And these reproductive calculations soon gained institutional backing. When the National Colonisation Society formed in 1830, biological reproduction was the explicit goal. The society, led by philanthropists and political economists, argued that the entire point of colonisation was to enable the greatest number of English paupers to enjoy the necessaries and comforts of life and to multiply in waste countries. Beyond restating Wakefield's selection principle, they echoed Malthus's analysis of early colonial Virginia. Population of Virginia was only 1,800 after 20 years, despite 9,000 immigrants arriving during that period. The reason? They were all men. New South Wales was likewise demographically disappointing, and for the same reason. The Society argued that the population of New South Wales was in the 40th year of the settlement, less than the number of immigrants during the 40 years. But if young couples had immigrated instead, Virginia and New South Wales would have boasted much larger settler populations. For Wakefield and the Society, age mattered as much as sex. They wanted young couples, not merely a balance between the sexes, as it was reproductive couples alone who could repopulate Britain's colonies. The National Colonisation Society's insistence on young heterosexual couples was far from immaterial. Indeed, Wakefield's ideas directly informed the 1834 South Australia Act. The new colony would be repopulated by young adults composed of the two sexes in equal proportions, enshrining in legislation what Wakefield had rehearsed in a letter from Sydney and elsewhere. Wakefield initially omitted Indigenous peoples from his analysis. In a letter from Sydney, Wakefield concerned himself with how colonists could repopulate a perfectly waste country, operating on the assumption that New World land was available for appropriation. In Wakefield's mind, Indigenous depopulation was not so much presumed as rendered irrelevant, for Australia was a wasteland, a wilderness, or a desert, that is, depopulated land ready to be repopulated. Wakefield and the promoters of South Australian colonisation held firm to the belief that uncultivated land was legitimately claimable through occupation and use, as the preamble to the 1834 South Australia Act set out. And yet, by the mid-1830s, it was increasingly difficult to sustain the fiction that New World lands were wastelands. With slavery abolished across the British Empire in 1834, the humanitarian movement turned its attention to the protection of Indigenous peoples. Against this backdrop, the South Australian Colonisation Commission was forced to recognise native title when formally establishing the colony in 1836. This recognition signals just how far the policy discussion had shifted since Wakefield had ignored Indigenous peoples in a letter from Sydney just 7 years earlier. In truth, the closer Wakefield and the systematic colonisers got to implementing their ideas in the 1830s, the more they were forced to confront the inescapable fact of prior occupation and ownership of already populated lands. Wakefield's colonisation plans for New Zealand marked an even bigger shift. In 1837, he began to incorporate the Māori into systematic colonisation, devoting a lengthy chapter of the British colonisation of New Zealand to the civilisation of the New Zealanders. The Māori, in Wakefield's view, inhabited a moral wilderness that could be reclaimed and cultivated through benevolent colonisation. He addressed depopulation directly. In the New Zealand Association's statement of objectives, he stressed the importance of Māori benefiting from systematic colonisation, rather than gradually being exterminated. He was careful to acknowledge the promises to civilise barbarians have often been used as pretexts for oppressing and exterminating them, language likely calculated to soothe humanitarian anxieties of our rapacious settlers. James Stephen, Permanent Under-Secretary at the Colonial Office, was unconvinced. His objection to Wakefield's plan was stark. It proposes the acquisition of the sovereignty in New Zealand, which would infallibly issue in the conquest and the extermination of the present inhabitants. To counter such criticism, Wakefield and the New Zealand Company outlined their own version of Indigenous protection through racial amalgamation. The promoters envisaged a racially mixed colonial settlement, where settlers and Aborigines would live side by side and reproduce together. Under their plans, intermarriage might even forge a union between the races. There is good reason to hope that under favourable circumstances, future generations of Europeans and natives may intermarry and become one people. The scheme was straightforward, if difficult in practice. The company would buy land cheaply from Maori, sell it at a profit to British settlers, and set aside 1/10 of the land in native reserves. No plan of colonisation ought to be encouraged or even tolerated, Wakefield now argued, that does not begin with the principle of upholding the rights and improving the condition of the Aborigines. As it turned out, Wakefield's critics were right to warn of violence and dispossession. The New Zealand company laid claim to vast tracts of Maori land, 20 million acres by late 1839. Yet tribal authority would yield to no corporation, however well fortified with capital and guns. The conceit that Maori would unreservedly welcome British settlers onto their lands was rebuked in the Wairau Affray of 1843, where the company's scheme of racial amalgamation resulted instead in bloodshed and death on both sides. There, on the fertile plains of the Wairau Valley, the clash between settler repopulation and indigenous depopulation exploded Wakefield's settler colonial fantasy. Race war, not racial crossings, was the bequest of systematic colonisation. The Roparaha, who had signed the famous Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, gave lie to the notion that sovereignty and property had been peaceably transferred. When the company persisted in surveying land in the Wairau Valley that Te Roparaha claimed through conquest, he joined forces with his nephew, Te Rangi Haieta, to raise the surveyors' huts to the ground. In what followed, 22 settlers were killed and at least 4 Māori, a body count at the very least raised serious questions about the company's policy of racial amalgamation. It was one thing to conjure up an ambitious political economy of colonisation in London, quite another to see it through in the Wairau Valley. To underline the point, Arthur Wakefield, the younger brother of Edward Gibbon, who had been recruited to build and repopulate the new Nelson settlement, was killed. Systematic colonisation had come undone on the frontier as settlers died on land that was supposed to reproduce and sustain life. British settlers would only outnumber Maori much later, on the eve of the 1860s land wars. As it happens, descendants of the Malthus family were 2 of them, one of whom repopulated Maori land with 9 children, the other with 11. By the 1840s, 2 decades of theorising, planning, and experience on the ground had rendered settler colonialism a recognised part of British political economy, as well as a policy conundrum. The welfare of Indigenous people was now such an inescapable matter that it was schematised as foundational by at least one political economist. Oxford's Herman Merivale, writing in the early 1840s, set out 3 policy possibilities for what was becoming known as the native question: extermination, protective reserves, or racial amalgamation. All 3 policy options were reforged in the age of colonial reform. By foregrounding depopulation and repopulation, we can see that colonial debates over Indigenous peoples and domestic debates over unemployment were linked rather more directly than has been previously recognised. Over the 1820s and 1830s, Merivale's native question and the condition of England question were 2 sides of the same political economy coin. The fact that there were people already on lands claimed by the Crown and its new settler colonies was not missed by the classical political economists themselves. It was theorised in principle by Malthus, whose population theory influenced both men and who named both war and extermination, even if he did nothing about it. It came across Horton's Colonial Office desk when he engaged with Six Nations diplomats, even while planning the repopulation of Upper Canada. And Wakefield experienced repopulation and depopulation, life and death, at close hand in New Zealand, where systematic colonisation was quickly coming undone. There was certainly war, but there was never extermination. Natives were not eliminated. On the colonial ground, neither depopulation nor repopulation were as orderly, self-evident, or systematic as the colonial reformers and sometimes the historians have imagined. Drawing together these histories, we can see how colonisation was at the time perceived to be, planned to be, and in actual fact was a process not just of immigration, but of simultaneous depopulation and repopulation. And yet demographic arithmetic, however carefully calculated, could not resolve the violence this collision entailed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Do people want to refill their glasses of water or have something to eat? We can take a minute if anyone wants to, and perhaps collect your thoughts and questions. For people joining us online, I'll ask you as well, if you would like to ask a question as we move to Q&A, if you could indicate by raising your hand or your digital or real hand. All right. So, when you have a moment, I'd like to invite questions from the floor. I might start with one while you're gathering your thoughts. Oh, I can see, I'll come to you in a moment, John, thank you. So, Matthew, I wanted to ask you, thank you for this really rich and very thoughtful paper. I wanted to ask you perhaps just a question of clarification in relation to Horton and Wakefield. It seemed like you were saying that Horton saw the problem of immigration and the repopulation of colonised lands as one of exporting surplus populations, so less desirable populations from Britain and Ireland that would somehow solve, imagine, domestic problems on the one hand and aid in colonisation on the other hand. Whereas on the other hand, it seemed as though Wakefield was arguing for a particular ideal type of reproductive couple that might be of not necessarily the surplus kind of variety, but rather imagined purely on its reproductive and capacities. Is that a fair summary? And perhaps if you can speak to how the kind of the type of immigrant is imagined in each case.
That's a very fair summary. I think they have a different point of emphasis. I think what you're getting at there is captured by, the pretty vast historiography on Wakefield that stresses class, right? The particular type of society that he's trying to create, and he's really emphasising those young reproductive couples. But what I've tried to do in this paper is show how fundamentally, even though their point of emphasis is different, they're still working in really fine detail through the specificities of repopulation. And that's where it's going back to Malthus very evidently. But I think your comment is an accurate characterization. I think Also, Wakefield is interested in creating entirely new colonial societies in a way that Horton never arrives at that point. The work and one that you're sort of probably familiar with is casting back to North America, right? And he's wanting to recreate a certain type of New World model in the South Pacific. Horton doesn't go that far. He's in London or on his estate in the Midlands, and he's thinking through repopulation, but with an eye on domestic political economy. Just so happens, through the archival stuff that I've done, that at that very moment, the stuff is coming across his desk.
Okay, so for him it's purely a sort of a numbers problem, a logistical problem of how do we facilitate this massive movement of people rather than any kind of utopian or kind of ameliorative vision of improvement through migration.
Yeah, nothing in his archive speaks to that grander vision that Wakefield has. And Wakefield's the guy who writes, it's a letter from Sydney. It's all about colonial society in Sydney and why it's gone wrong and how to fix it. Horton writes about pauperism in Britain in his text.
John, please.
Wakefield made a great deal of the importance of immigration being socially stratified so the landowners would have workers. I mean, the predecessors of Wakefield, do they hit this point as well?
So did Horton emphasise that point, or?
Right, did Horton or any of the others, including Malthus?
That's a good question, and I've had variants of this asked before, which is always interesting. Horton is interested in labour in the New World, obviously. He goes into it in some detail, and that's why he's interested in you've got to have children out there, because that's an extra pair of hands to do the work that's required. But I suppose your question is sort of getting at the deeper genealogy behind Wakefield's arguments about the type of workers and so forth. And I don't have a good answer to that, but I'm just starting a book on Wakefield, so I should go and find out.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Tamsin interloping from UTS. Excuse me. Thank you for a great paper. I'm interested in whether Horton or Wakefield map out a place for education in any of their schemes. By the 1920s, 1820s and 30s, new US state constitutions have land endowments for education built into their constitutions, federal land grants to support schooling. This is the case in Nova Scotia and Upper Canada from the 1890s onwards as well. Comes across Colonial Secretary's desk. So, and by the 1830s too, late 1830s, Maori lands are being set aside as endowments to support Maori education. And obviously, schooling children is part of a populating agenda, which becomes, very intense in the settler colonies in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. So I'm wondering whether there is a place mapped out for
education.
Fashioning not just the labour force of the future, but also a kind of civic force, whether that's framed not yet democratically necessarily, but And there's a certain follow-up question which comes because the introduction of Wakefieldian policies from the 1830s onwards actually prevent colonies from setting aside land endowments for education, a power which was only resumed after responsible government, hence the 60s, 1860s, 70s. So there's a kind of paradox there that this version of population and repopulation through educational provision of stolen land, this is part of the way you encourage families to the frontier is to promise that you'll set up a school there, is actually suspended, for those 2 decades.
It ties back quite nicely to Steve's point, I think, because he is interested in that grander vision of the colony. And when you read through a letter from Sydney, I mean, it's such an odd text. It's very polemical and kind of all over the place. But he does talk about, he makes weird statements like every colony should have a political economist, and he's talking about the intellectual fabric of the society, but in this kind of quite loose way. And I don't know how programmatic it then become. Now I'm thinking, well, what do the companies do about that impulse, which is there. I don't see it in Horton, but it's there in Wakefield. Bruce Curtis, I think is his name. I'll send you the article, has written, and I think it's actually in an education journal, and he's written about moral character and education in Wakefield. So that could be quite interesting. Just the second part of could you recapitulate that?
So the ways education is funded
Yeah.
in Nova Scotia, Upper Canada, and the American United States is through setting aside land endowments. So large chunks of land are given to schools, churches, who lease them out, and the money from that land funds the schooling. And this is systematized in these states. And, we see this in New South Wales with the church and schools land endowment, where 1/7 of the state of New South Wales is dedicated to education and schooling in 1821. But when Wakefieldian policies are introduced, states lose their ability, governors lose their ability, as you know, to give land grants. So this ability to fund education through land endowment is suspended. And it's only when the colonies have self-government granted to them and with them control of the land estate that ability to use land to finance education is something that they resume control of. And then they immediately, in New Zealand, in Canada, and also in Australia, start to use the land estate to fund the establishment of education. So it's, and often that's as the frontier of settlement is expanding. And it's really explicitly, both in that earlier period and the later period, described as a way to settle these lands. You need schools and churches, right, to kind of, schools run by churches in the earlier period. So it's really interesting. I'm really interested in it, in the place in the theory, the political economy, as well as in the practice.
I mean, I want to read about Port Nicholson, that's Wellington. It's a really good book, recently come out by John Martin, who's the parliamentary librarian in New Zealand for like 20 years, and it's full of this really granular detail about how these essential services were funded and financed, because that's the model, and the company is trying to pay for infrastructure and so on, and where does education come into that? I don't have my sort of nose right to the ground.
But it's not in the text, it's not in the theory.
It's more looser. is my sense of that.
David?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Matthew, for a really, really interesting paper. Now, I'm either going to betray that I didn't understand something you were saying, or I'm just going to betray my general ignorance of this topic. But I was utterly fascinated by the ideas about Chinese population of Australia. And maybe you've partially answered my question by your repeated use of the word loose in answer to the previous question. But really, what Irish or British problem was that ever going to solve? And I'm kind of fascinated also, given what I know, or perhaps what I don't know, about racialized discourses of the period. Why any of these writers would think that encouraging or even floating the idea of a Chinese population of Australia would be something they'd want to do.
Thank you, David. Just taking a note. I really wish Joel was here, and we've been having back and forth conversations about putting our heads together, and I hope we do. As me, the Wakefield scholar, and Joel, expert on modern Chinese history, to think through. I'm just he's away now and has got his big book project trying to finish up. So that's kind of held that line of inquiry down a little bit. In terms of your question of what Irish or British question that Chinese repopulation is solving, again, a little bit back to Steve's observation. I think Wakefield is thinking about, obviously he's thinking about British domestic political economy that sort of generates a set of questions that he's interested in, but he's interested in what's happening in Sydney, and that's his primary focus. And it's just really interesting that, this figure that at one point in the historiography was, the great hero of British imperialism in the Antipodes, how actually he had thought much more expansively about different, not just a different labour source, but creation of a different type of society that kind of goes against much of what we know about Wakefield. But I should say there's an emerging sort of body of work that is looking at Wakefield's more enlarged racial scope. So I'm thinking of people like Jane Lydon, Angela Woolacott. It's written in the context of Australand in Western Australia, so I don't want to claim that this is me, finding this really new stuff. But yeah.
Okay. I mean, can I just for a second throw the politics back into political economy and ask, and maybe there's not enough information to know, but are these people envisaged ultimately, or their descendants envisaged to become, loyal subjects of the crown?
The Chinese immigrants. Yeah, that proposal, as far as I understand, it doesn't really go anywhere, right?
Yeah, right.
And this is where like a lot more work would need to go into this line of inquiry. But I'd hazard a guess and say yes. You would imagine them as, but I don't say that with really any great authority.
Sure. Thanks.
I think Jared had a question.
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up on that, but first, it's great to hear this presented again after reading a draft of it a little while ago. I think it's a great paper. I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. I suppose I want to, in kind of following up on David's question, invite you to hypothesize at least a little bit. And the elements of it, I think, are there in the paper already. You mentioned that New South Wales's demographic performance is disappointing, poses a labour problem and like a labour weight on the British state. To what extent is this like suggestion about Chinese labour like a simple solution to the labour problem that can help generate and start the colony anew in a way that might make it more appealing for immigrants in Britain to choose?
Yes, I'd not thought about that. I mean, in a way, the position in the text itself, right, the postscript sort of diagnosed the problem, all the ills of colonial society, and we need a new model, but it's also, here's one way that we can actually solve this problem. So I think they are quite tightly connected. But yeah, I must confess it's, for the purposes of this article, I kind of had an idea of it being a different piece with Joel, and I hope it will become a different piece. But it was just too striking, the stuff in the letter from Sydney was too striking not to include in this paper because it got to the like brass tacks of reproductive immigration. So I've kind of left it there, but I'm getting a sense from David and yourself that there's more work to be done there.
It might be a link back to Malthus as well. Like, I remember when we read the Malthus stuff years and years ago at the beginning of the Laureate Centre, where Malthus is doing that kind of arithmetic about, different races and nations and reproductive rates and checks and balances on that. Whether that's something that's sitting in Wakefield at that moment too is an open question. That would be relevant in this paper.
Yeah.
And is there any sense of the proximity of China to Australia as well? Is that part of the rationale?
Less than a letter from Sydney, which is his 1829 text. In 1833, he has this much expanded text, England and America, and it's like his big kind of, it's Wakefield's kind of go at like a kind of big wealth nations type of political economy treaties. And there's quite a lot on, I forget exactly how he is framing that up, but there is a sense of geographical proximity and also free trading possibility as well. And he talks about the sort of commercial network, and that's something that I really want to develop with Joel, is looking at how what he's doing there is connected to early 19th century debates about colonial trade and the like. Yeah.
So different take on the imperialism of free trade.
Yeah.
Leo, I think was next.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I'm not sure you have covered in your paper, you read it like a while ago, but it's like this Wakefield ever kind of contemplate this sort of like comparison between the type of like free labor free movement of labor he envisioned versus the previous forms of like enslaved labor and also like indentured labor that were prevalent for the Chinese and South Asian immigrants. And also on that note, so why like Wakefield didn't think about like bringing like people from South Asia into like Australia because it's also like British Crown. So why? I mean, that time they still have like the Indian colony, but I just wonder why India is like pretty close. Like close to Australia too.
He briefly discusses India, but I think he's attracted to this sort of commercial type of. I need to go back to the 1833 text where he sort of lays it out.
Yeah, and that's before opium war, so trying to have them completely open up. So that's
the stuff on labour, Allison's written about this. on Wakefield and slavery. And again, that's really, really interesting and fascinating. He comments on, there's a very strident critique against, obviously, penal transportation. So he's holding all these different, as you'd expect from a political economist, holding all these different types of labour, juggling them in the air.
Hi, thank you. That was so great. I was just trying to work out, and this is probably a tricky question, the legal framework underpinning a lot of it and how it might fit into wider histories around the shift from legal plurality in this period towards legal uniformity and perfect territorial sovereignty. In particular, the part where Wakefield says that he envisages a racially mixed settlement where they live side by side. I'm simply going to purchase the land. And then Stephen's coming in and saying, no, this is an assertion of sovereignty, and to that extent we will require conquest and extermination. It seems like there's an interesting argument potentially to be made through joining your research with that scholarship and sort of looking at the implications of what perfect territorial sovereignty actually mean in terms of extermination and depopulation, you know, like, and if that is what they're meaning. I mean, I wondered at the beginning whether they were talking about sovereignty or possession. You know, possession absolutely allows them to live side by side. It's not a claim of sovereignty. You know, that kind of fantasy of a sort of cosmopolitan mixing goes along with a particular legal claim to land. And that shifts really dramatically around the empire at this time. You see it with the Bill people in India, the way that the East India Company deals with them. At precisely this moment, Canada, New Zealand, there's this shift towards legal uniform sovereignty, and with that extermination. It's a hardening,
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think of Shauna Dorset's work here
absolutely.
in the New Zealand context. And then obviously, you know, Lisa Ford's work as well. It's a really helpful comment, because I haven't sort of packaged into this talk the big framing, partly because it's just so hard. Alison and I wrote it, but, you know, because it's a big article, looking at repopulation, depopulation through 3 different people and then the various literatures. But we've sent it off, and I want to have another crack at the overall framing, and I hadn't thought of slotting the analysis into that legal history, which I find very compelling. You know, people like Birchall and Dawson and stuff. The other question I got myself into knots when I was writing it about what precisely is the relationship between possession/dispossession and depopulation. And in the rewrite, I need to nail that down. It's difficult. The way I'm sort of looking at it is, well, it is a, you know, spatial form of depot. It's removal from land, but it's kind of rubbing up against actual, you know, death as well. Some of those the quotes that I've read out. And so it's just trying to, I guess the challenge is trying to keep both of those things alive while being very precise and very sharp about exactly what I mean. Because when Horton is engaging with depopulation, it's different to, you know, Wakefield and Malthus. And I think I can make a virtue of that, potentially, but that just requires some careful phrasing.
Anyone on? I have a half-formed question while others are gathering their thoughts. I was struck in particular by your initial framing of this period as being one coming at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and this transition from war to peace, apparently, when actually the story you're telling is very much a story, in many ways, of war by the means, right? A different kind of warfare. And so this is a sort of historiographically naive question, so you don't work really on this period or this place so much. But I'm just curious to know if you could speak to that and perhaps to the innovation of this depopulation, repopulation framework as a way perhaps of shedding light on the nature of frontier violence and the various vocabularies of war, extermination, dispossession, and so on, aside from the obvious ones of the actual settlers killing indigenous people and so on. Like, how does this kind of how does political economy itself perform certain violence and facilitate a kind of a sorry, it's a big question.
That's a very half-formed question, right? The war by, I like how you put that, the war by other means in a way. It's, I think it's from the British political economy perspective, end of wars with France, right? It's the classics of demobilisation, very strained financial state Britain is in, and that's feeding into the generation of this condition of, what is later called the condition of England question. But you're then right as well. That sets up this big conversation about settler colonialism. But, keep in mind, Malthus already, in 1803, had said war and extermination. He saw it, Wharton didn't really, and Wakefield had to confront it, even though, he's not contemplating war to begin with. The big question is it about what depopulation and repopulation adds to histories of settler colonial violence? Is it what purchase it has? Is that?
I suppose so. Given, again, my sense on the outside of these discussions is that there's been so much work done on frontier violence in the last few decades. And so I'm wondering, thinking about the particular contributions of this rich piece, the extent to which you can also be adding to that.
I think we're, and Alison may think differently, but I feel like we're adding to that really rich literature. And we're adding to it by coming through British political economy. That's what we're sort of hopefully adding to the literature. So it's a different tradition that we're intervening in that.
Anyone else online? Don't be shy. Yes, Heidi.
I think I get what you're saying about, you're thinking about a British political economy, but I can't help but want to understand what they made of the rapid growth of the emerging population of Aboriginal children born of the invaders. So that's sort of, I don't hear that in your depopulation, repopulation story. So what did these characters make of that?
Wharton doesn't think anything of it, to put it bluntly. He's concerned with the arithmetic of repopulating Upper Canada, and he's got this very particular dispute about land that he's dealing with. But it doesn't go beyond that. It's my reading of his archive. Wakefield. You know, it's, again, you know, we would consider it like really unsatisfactory because he's just writing about this place that he never goes to. And so the nuance of his population discussion is really, really limited, and I don't see it there either. You know, but that's where, yeah, as historians, we can add that context and thought about that. I can't speak for Malthus.
I have a follow-up question. This is a bit far-fetched, but I'm just wondering, like, did Wakefield ever think of like the political consequences in the long term of repopulation, of population growth in these settler colonies? Like, did he even ever imagine that this place will, like, for example, like Canada Confederate shortly after Wakefield died, I guess, and then like Canada Confederate in 1867, right? That's after Wakefield died. Right.
Yeah.
But still, like, did you see any possibility that these places begin to have their coming certain form of sovereignty that will enact their own, you know, like border and like migration rules and all that? Like, did they even like ever imagine that?
Yeah. Horton, no. He's running these pretty small experiments. And then Wakefield does have these grand visions. But the purpose of this article is trying to contextualize it with its own time and keep that longer run replenishing the Earth story off to one side.
Right. So in their writings, like back in those like 30s and 40s, they didn't imagine that possibility yet.
Well, Wakefield, he's talking about all of Australia being full up, right?
Okay, that's pretty
and so he does have that really big idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the
Population, settler
think
population.
about that kind of like fully populated Australia will create new policy, but like not like unlike the current like
and
British colony.
Wakefield has a very very particular model of sort of devolved colonial societies, and he fleshes that out in quite a lot of detail. So he's very alert to.
And without any sense of what later ecologists would call the carrying capacity of Australia, or ecologically indifferent to the...
Not Wakefield. No.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just want to,
Yeah, please, Abhijit.
I think you should take that Heidi's question. I think there's a close reading to be done of the family, encouraging families of 3 children to come in and settle. What is that? Why 3? Why families? Why not single men? There's does single men mean more scope for interracial contact? What is the? Because there is, in fact, parallels of that in British Empire, in India and Africa, where you have had contact between soldiers and sex workers or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
So there is already that problem of hygiene and sexual promiscuity. So that's traveling, that's it. And venereal diseases and all of that is already in place, all of that discussion. So I'm just saying, though your paper isn't about all of that, there might be a question of kids in this entire scenario, which you might want to go back and read closely, because there's something happening here. Malthus
Given the New Zealand case.
Yes, yeah, I don't think Malthus is fixated on number of children, or for that matter, the migration, the kind of migration that should happen from this part of the world to the other, excuse me. I feel like that is something I'm not familiar with in this, I might be wrong, but just revisiting that question might be useful.
That's a really good
If not for the
point.
article, then just.
Thank you, Dave.
For that.
Taking point.
Any final chances? Speak now for about 100 please. or at least hold your peace until next time we meet. Can you join me in thanking Matthew for